Okay, just
Okay. So welcome everyone to another session of the Virtual Kant Congress. And today it is our pleasure to receive the Greece Kant group. And they will host a session titled Kant in Greece, Greece in Kant, which is a very exciting title. And it shows not only the intercultural dimension of our Congress, but also it engages with Kant's own engagement with the history of philosophy. So we are all very much looking forward to it. And the host of the session today is Dimitris Karidas, who is professor of philosophy at the University of Athens. And I will now hand it over to Dimitris, who will host the session. And after the meeting, we will leave the Zoom meeting open for informal conversations. So you are all very welcome to stay a little bit later so that we can chat more about this session. So thank you for the Greece. Thank you, Yanis, for putting the session together, and thank you, Dimitris, for chairing it. So,
Dimitris, sorry, please. I just wanted to remark that Kostas Androulidakis
Kostas is here.
So okay, it's good. So, Dimitris, please, the floor.
Okay, everybody. So, will we reverse the order or follow the original one? Since Kostas is also here.
As you wish, Kostas, would you want to go first as was the original order?
If you would like to begin with the original order, but I would like to have 1 minute to share my PowerPoint, except when Yanis would like to share the PowerPoint for me, because in this way we could save some time.
Okay. So let me start with the introduction then. Thank you very much also for, if I may say so, on behalf of all the Greek philosophers interested in Kant. Let me also point out that here we have all generations of Greek Kant specialists representing, so to speak, very different points of view and different traditions. That's very nice, and I'm very happy to be able to welcome and see and hear all these old friends of mine. Okay, so with the we will split. The plan is to split this section in two and follow the original order, the order as it was planned. So. Professor Androulidakis and Professor Vervidakis will go first, and who will talk, will give us a historical expositions from a point of view of the history of ideas concerning the reception of Kant. I would not waste your time with very lengthy introductions. Both of them are very well known, not only to us, but I'm sure to most of you, if not all of you. Professor Androulidakis, who will go first, is Professor of Philosophy in Creta. And he has distinguished himself not only for his original contributions on Kant's ethical philosophy, but also on many translations he has made of a number of books by Kant. It is too long to list. Primarily, as I said, in the field of ethical philosophy, Metaphysik der Sitten, and so on. Okay. So, Kostas, you have the floor, the virtual floor.
Thank you very much, Dimitri. Dear colleagues, dear friends, I beg your pardon for my delay. So, I would like to say some words about Kant in Greece in the 20th century. The only thing I could make is to give just a synoptic overview of the presence of Kant in Greece in the 20th century, and we may proceed to the first, or in this, to the second dial. What's the word? The second image. Yes. So I would like to begin with a very short historical background. I think that philosophy in Greece is present from antiquity to the present, despite all difficulties. We have just a few words about the historical background. We have had a revival of philosophy in the 17th century and the great movement of Neo-Hellenic Enlightenment in the 18th century. And the head of this movement has been Adamantios Korais, who has been an eminent scholar for classical scholars. The first Kantian in Greece has been Koumas. Well, I would burden you with some names, but we cannot avoid that. Then in the 19th century, we have the first, so to speak, Greek university in Corfu, the so-called Ionian Academy, where there have been many eminent idealists about German idealism, and also Kantians, Hegelians, and so on. And then with the founding of the University of Athens in 1837, we have the beginning of, so to speak, the cultivation of academic systematic philosophy, both in the fields of systematic philosophy, but also in the field of history of philosophy. So that would be just a few words for the historical background, and we could go to the next image. So in the 20th century, I would like to say some words about some forerunners and founders, so to speak, of both of philosophy in general and of the Kantian philosophy especially. We have had the first translations of Kant's works, for example, the Critique of Pure Reason, and later the Prolegomena, the groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals, and so on. A very great name in the history of philosophy in the 20th century in Greece has been Voreas, Theophilos Voreas, who was not exactly Kantian, but he has brought a better knowledge about Kant, so to speak. He had been a student of Wundt, of Wilhelm Wundt, and he is important in Greece because he has written many systematic handbooks in almost all philosophical disciplines, and he has been also important because he has introduced the philosophical terminology. Then, with the founding of the University of Thessaloniki in 1925-26, we have some scholars who have promoted a better knowledge of Kant. For example, the second name, Theodorakopoulos, was a neo-Kantian. Another name has been Imvriotis, who has combined Kant and Marx. And also another name, the last name here, namely Hieros, who has again promoted a better knowledge about Kant and has written, for example, a book From Kant to Fichte. So we can go to the next image. I hope the rhythm is not very fast. I'm somewhat in a hurry not to delay myself. So a very great movement for Kant in the 20th century in Greece has been the movement of Greek Neo-Kantianism, especially about in the late 20s and 30s. There has been a group, so to speak, of Greek students of philosophy, all of them in Heidelberg. So they were students, for example, of Heinrich Rickert, but also of Jaspers, Karl Jaspers. And so we call them the Heidelberg Neo-Kantians. Those people have been important in Greece because they have also had public offices in Greek public life. For example, the first name here, Tsatsos, has been minister many times, and at the end, president of the Republic. So he has been really important for bringing Neo-Kantianism in Greece, combining it with Platonism, Neoplatonism, Neo-Hegelianism, and so on. He is important especially for philosophy of law and political philosophy, but also for the promoting of humanism and humanities and human studies. The next name we have heard about him a minute before is Theodorakopoulos. He has been the holder of the chair of philosophy in the University of Athens for many, many decades. So he has been important in this sense. Again, Theodorakopoulos has been both Neo-Kantian and Neo-Platonic, and he is important for systematic philosophy in Greece, but also for history of philosophy. The next name, Kanellopoulos, was not so much, so to speak, a professional philosopher, but again, he has been important for political life in Greece. He has even been twice prime minister. So he was, I think, the first professor of sociology in Greece, at least in the University of Athens. And he has written a work about the history of European culture in many volumes. An important thing we could state is that those people have founded the Archive of Philosophy and Theory of Sciences, a philosophical journal, which has been important in Greece for 11 years, in which many important scholars, also foreign scholars, have written. For example, Jaspers and other people of the Neo-Kantian school, and Jaspers, of course, is not just Neo-Kantian, but I mean many important people and even famous people have written in this and published, I mean, in this archive. So please, to the next image. And sorry for bothering John with this handling the PowerPoint. So a great figure in the 20th century in Greece has been Papanoutsos, who is mainly a philosopher, a systematic philosopher, but also a philosopher of education. Not many people know that he has been actually Neo-Kantian, but if one studies his work better, one can see that he has been Neo-Kantian along with other things. For example, philosophy of life, Bergson, humanism, pragmatism, and so on. He has tried to make something like a systematic synthesis, and this he does in his philosophical and systematic trilogy, which consists of 3 works: epistemology, ethics, and aesthetics. And one of these works, namely epistemology, has even been translated in English and has been published in the State University of New York Press in 1968, something of which he was very proud, of course, because it's not something very which happens very often in Greece, that our works are being translated in foreign language. So this Papanoutsos has been really a major philosopher and reformer of education. I mean, also for public life. Twice in this century, he was the spiritus rector, so to speak, of the educational reform. There have been other reformers of education too, who have been important for Greek education, and they were too Kantian and Neo-Kantian, although this is not very known. For example, these names at the end of the image or picture, I mean, Delmouzos, Glinos, and Triantafylidis were in their philosophy of education actually Kantians or Neo-Kantians. For example, Triantafylidis is very important in Greece because he's the author of the official grammar of modern Greek. So please, to the next image. Now, some words about the academic philosophy in Greece, especially in the second half of the 20th century. Of course, the chronological points are here only conventional. We have a pluralism of philosophical movements and streams, but I don't say much about this because our colleague Stelios Virvidakis is going to say something about that. So a great name in Greek philosophy has been the first name here, namely Gianaras, I mean Anastasios Gianaras, who is important above all because he has translated the first part of the Critique of Pure Reason in a very good translation, actually, though this translation needs to be revised. He was important also for phenomenology. He has been a student of Heidegger and Fink in Freiburg, and he was also the successor of Eugen Fink in Freiburg. Another name has been Moutsopoulos, who was another dominant figure in systematic philosophy in Greece. He was also in some sort Kantian and neo-Kantian, but also some other things. He has occupied himself with phenomenology and so on. And it is important of him another philosophical trilogy with 3 parts: beings, ideas, and values. Another name has been the following names were Greek philosophers who have lived and worked mostly abroad. For example, the first name Vlachos was an important figure for political philosophy in Greece, and he has written an important book on the political philosophy of Kant, and you see it has been published in Presse Universitaire de France. Castoriadis, I think, is much more known. One thing about him is that his imaginary institution of society, you see it has been published in France, 75. It has been mostly influenced or very much influenced by the concept of imagination by Kant, which he doesn't stress very much, I would like to say. The 2 following names, namely Christos Axelos, he is the brother, or he was the brother of another philosopher, Kostas Axelos. Well, Christos Axelos and Christos Gianaras are, I think, interesting because their concept of freedom is mostly Kantian. For example, the Christos Gianaras is important for some reason in Greece, about which, again, Stelios Virvidakis is going to say a word. And his concept of freedom is much more Kantian than he himself acknowledges, so to speak. Another name is Professor Kuchuradi. She lives in Turkey, and she is important for ethics and especially, above all, for the theory of human rights. I mean, she's the great name of the theory of human rights in Turkey. I wouldn't like to say many things about it now, because of the irony of the thing. It's something which will not bother us now. Another great name in Greece has been Psychopedis, Kosmas Psychopedis, who has combined Kant and the so-called Frankfurt School, or the critical theory, namely Marx also, Hegel and Max Weber and Habermas and so on. He has promoted a critical theory of values. So we can go to the next image. About the present, I would like to say only a few things. You see here, I have tried to make a sort of systematic division of subjects. I would like to say that we have a very vivid scholarship and original research in Greece today. For example, in the field of epistemology and metaphysics, we have these subjects are only, of course, a selection of a great group. We have many works about Platonism in Kant and the ideas and the status, the ontological status of ideas and so on. You see the names in how do we say, parentheses? How do we say the word here? I have forgotten the word here, in not quotation marks, which I would not like now to name because it would be a delay in our time procedure. In moral philosophy, in Kantian moral philosophy and philosophy of education, again, we have a very vivid work and research. You can see some names here. For example, I would only like to name a work of our colleague Philemon Peonidis, who has written a very important work, I think, about autonomy and sympathy, a post-Kantian moral image. You see a sort of combination of Kant and post-Kantian moral philosophy. In bioethics, we have an important postgraduate or graduate program at the University of Crete, where our colleague Mrs. Tsinorema is responsible, and I think it's an important research center for bioethics in Greece. About Kant and the so-called Frankfurt School or critical theory, again, we have a great interest in Greece with the colleagues you see here, for example, Kavoulas and George Sangriotis. But the field which is, I think, one of the most interesting fields in Greece in relation with Kant is the philosophy of law, where we could say that the philosophy of law in Greece now is almost totally Kantian. You see, the names here are, I think, important, and one could say really that the philosophy of law in Greece today is almost totally Kantian. So we can proceed to our next image. I hope I am in my time limits. Yes, some words about the philosophical scene in Greece nowadays. I think the Kantian scholarship in Greece is serious, mostly, vivid, international, critical, cosmopolitan, and promising. We have, for example, special issues in philosophical magazines, international conferences on Kant, for example, in the anniversary year 2004, also another conference of the Alexander von Humboldt Stiftung in the year 16, an important one of the French Society of Kantian Studies, SEKLF, and so on. We have translations of Kant's work, almost all main works, including the critiques. So one could only wish as a desideratum or desiderata for the future, inter alia, that we could have new annotated translations, for example, of the first critique, of some essays. We have also already translations of the essays of Kant, but we need still more of the anthropology, of letters of Kant, and so on. And we still need even stronger international presence. And I think my last word would be that for Greece too, it holds true. Kant and no end. Thank you very much for your patience and excuse me for my delay. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much, Kostas, for this overview of over many centuries, and especially of Kant research in Greece, of the reception of Kant, and especially of the picture you gave us today of where things stand. I would like to welcome now Professor Stelios Virvidakis. He was for many decades professor at the Department of the History and Philosophy of Science at the University of Athens, responsible for very many cooperations, the organization of conferences, very long list of research activities. He has also published a great number of works, it's too long to list here, on Kant's moral philosophy, on ancient philosophy, and so on. But what I would like to point out, with his permission, of course, is that he has always distinguished himself as a public intellectual in Greece, contributing this particularly philosophical attitude in a great number of discussions on important issues concerning the Greek society of today. So, Stelios, without any further ado, I would like to ask you to take the floor.
Thank you so much. Let me first begin by thanking the organizers for inviting me, and thanking Yannis and also Dimitris for his kind introduction. So I'm going to share my screen, and I have a PowerPoint continuing what you have already seen from Kostas, and commenting on some of the things he said. So share screen, and let me see. Can you see it? Okay, so you can see and hear me.
Yes.
Okay, So I call this long title, The Reception of Kant's Philosophy and of its Legacy in Modern Greece, in Contemporary Greece, I should say, which is moving from the 20th to the 21st century, which is the present. Alternative approaches to recent construals. Now, let me begin with some preliminary remarks, and let me also apologize for this historical and expository nature of what I'm going to present, which is mostly history of ideas in Greece rather than engaging in systematic philosophical discussion. It's not a strictly philosophical talk. So in this time, I wouldn't be able to say much. However, towards the end, I'm going to touch upon some issues that concern the Kantian community, the community of Kant scholars in Greece and other philosophers interested in Kant. And some of them you can hear today. And I believe that both Maria-Elena and Yanis will just fill in the lack of my philosophical analysis, so to speak. So what I'm going to try to do is just to try to link some of the developments with academic backgrounds, influences, and mostly German and Anglo-American, but also French, as you have seen with Moutsopoulos. Again, what is a little, let's say, a disadvantage that we have, in a sense, is that we are at the periphery of developments. Nowadays, of course, there is no periphery because thanks to communication all over the world through the web and so on. But we, being at the periphery and writing in Greek, a lot of things in Greek, maybe we don't publish as much as we should in other languages, and we don't engage in debates as much as we would like to. And there are also institutional and educational issues related to teaching philosophy in Greece and relating to academic institutions like universities. In fact, as you're going to see, as I'm going to say, Crete, the University of Crete, is the stronghold, is the Kantian castle, as I call it, with Kant scholars. Two of them you can see today, and one of them was my student, Yanis, and I'm really very happy and proud of his work. And there are issues related to how higher education functions in Greece. I can say some things about that in the discussion if you want. That's more sociological. And of course, there are Kantian ideas and their legacy in other areas of academic and broader intellectual activity. As Dimitri said, I mean, he was kind enough to point out that some of us are trying to be public intellectuals, whatever that may mean. And Kostas has also pointed out that two of the old guard, let's say, of philosophers in Greece were also politicians involved in politics, and one of them became president of the republic, the philosopher king, or the philosopher president, if you like. Now, of course, nowadays, as you know, what we are really interested in is the extent to which Greek scholars do contribute to original research, publications, and ongoing discussions. And you have already seen or heard some names of the Greek academic diaspora, such as Castoriadis or Axelos. Of course, there was this other Axelos, and many of the scholars are people who have come from abroad to Greece. Now, this presentation, this summary analysis is just a repetition of what Kostas said in a different way, in a different structure, if you like. So in the beginning of the 20th century, you have these people who called themselves idealists, and they were neo-Hegelians and neo-Kantians, mostly educated in Germany. Then you have the Marxists, some German-educated Marxists at the beginning, who were in a kind of debate with the idealists. And among them, more recently, as Kostas has pointed out, there is a dominant influence of the Frankfurt School, but also there is an Althusserian school of Greek Marxists who are not so close to Kant, I'm afraid. Now, phenomenology, Husserl and Heidegger, you have some very, very good Kantian scholars among these people educated in Germany. My colleague and friend George Xiropaidis is a Heidegger specialist, but he's very, very knowledgeable in Kant. And we teach Kant seminars, critique of pure reason, from different perspectives, analytic and phenomenological. Of course, there are people who are into hermeneutics. There was a dominant trend of French existentialism. I'm not going to say much. Now, analytic philosophy is now thriving in Greece. I belong to a department of history and philosophy of science. Most of the philosophers of which in this department are analytic philosophers in epistemology, philosophy of science. There are people interested in Kantian philosophy of science, philosophy of language, analytic metaphysics, metaethics. I'm myself interested in metaethics, aesthetics, philosophy of mathematics, philosophy of religion. More recently, Wittgenstein. We have a very good Wittgenstein specialist in my department. And there is always some kind of Neoplatonism tradition in Greece, which goes back to Theodorakopoulos, mentioned before. And there is a group of people whom we call neo-Orthodox and Hellenophile. This is a more, if you like, slightly provincial or parochial group, which is a little like the Slavophiles in Russia. And although, as Kostas pointed out, one of them, Christos Giannaras, has some views about freedom which are more Kantian than he thinks, he would oppose Kantian ethics very vigorously, and he would defend some kind of virtue ethics, I think, personalist and virtue ethics. Now, the study of Kant, how is Kant studied and to what extent? There is a variety in Greek institutions, as I said, the university institutional issue, variety of undergraduate and graduate courses and seminars in practically every big university. Some of them are devoted to Kant's theoretical and practical philosophy and to basic texts, such as the three critiques. In my department, we teach regularly the first critique at the graduate level, but also the second critique, and we have also taught third critique and also Kant's religion within the limits of reason alone, also translated by Kostas. And there are specialists in most universities, but as I said, I have written in bold, the University of Crete is the Kantian castle. Patras has some good Kantians. Aristotle University of Thessaloniki, Pantheon University of Social and Political Sciences, and the Department of History and Philosophy of Science, my department at this NQUA means the University of Athens, but I'm going to explain the title later if you are interested. It's the name of the founder, Kapodistrian University, National and Kapodistrian University of Athens. Now, liberal Kantian, neo-Kantian philosophy at the School of Law. Kostas has spoken about these people. They are basically Rawlsian and Dworkinians, but also they know Kant very, very well. So nowadays, in the philosophy of law in Athens, you can learn a lot about Kant, and thesis dissertations are being written in this direction. Now, publications and doctoral dissertations on Kant's philosophy and its legacy. There are people working on the transcendental subject in the first critique, on moral conscience and moral motivation. Some of these people are doctoral students of ours who are attending this very conference. Responsibility and accountability in Kant's practical philosophy, metaphysics of morals, which is not studied as much as it should, is being studied by our graduate students. There are well-attended online seminars for the wider public. Xiropaidis and myself are teaching an online seminar for the wider public on the first critique. And it's surprising how much people we have, and interested people, good people. And even in school textbooks, I'm the author of a school textbook, we have seen to it that Kant appears, and I think in a decent way, although everybody says it's difficult, we don't understand, but we have also managed to include it in high school philosophy. Now, some basic issues going more philosophical and interpretative issues. Now, as you know, there is this big debate between a two-world and a two-aspect interpretation, metaphysical, two-aspect metaphysical, and two-aspect strictly epistemological or meta-philosophical of Kant's transcendental idealism. Now, Marjelena and myself support some kind of form of metaphysical two-aspect view, although she might go as far as a two-world reading, accepting a two-world reading. She may say some things later. And this is, I summarize this by referring to well-known scholars from Strawson to Geyer and from Proust to Allison, including Longuenesse, Langton, Allais, and others. Well, I would say we are more for Proust and Allison in Greece rather than Strawson and Geyer, although my doctoral thesis was on Strawson, Kant, and Wittgenstein. Now, original publications and work in progress referring to the possibility of transcendental philosophical knowledge, relation between transcendental arguments and transcendental idealism, Kant's philosophical methodology, Kant's use of thought experiments in the first and second critique, the transcendental subject, as I said, Kant's conception of the laws of nature, Yannis has worked on this, Kant's philosophy of biology and teleological judgments, Kant's conception of autonomy and its differences from contemporary liberal views, Millian views mostly, promises and lying. Kondos has written an interesting book on promises, Kantian theory of promising in Patras. The moral law and moral motivation, there are good papers on what kind of connection between moral law and moral motivation. Recently, I have been interested in moral argument, in Kant's moral argument for the existence of God. Kostas is writing on Kant's anthropology. Kant's philosophy of history is being studied. Kant's views on revolution, especially the French Revolution. The transition from Kant to Hegel, we have quite a few Hegelians in Greece. And we have also the good old debate, Kant and Hegel or Kant versus Hegel and vice versa. Kant, German idealism and romanticism, and Kantian perspectives in bioethics, Kostas has summarized it. Now, today, recent construals. Well, my Kantian, my construal of Kant was a kind of Wittgensteinian construal. That's what I call my Kantenstein. Some people spoke about Kripkenstein, talking about Kripke and Wittgenstein. I like to speak of a Kantenstein conception and Kantian readings of Wittgenstein. That's in theoretical philosophy. In moral philosophy, there is a kind of rift or split between the constructivists, course guardians, and moderate realist construals of Kant's positions. I have defended the view, the rather unorthodox view of a weak Platonism. Kant, Wittgenstein, McDowell, Patton, I'll say a word about that. Now, McDowell is a very important influence in Greece. McDowell's presence and impact are very important through conferences in Patras, where you get a McDowellian Kant and a McDowellian Hegel, of course, following Kant. Heideggerian readings, I refer to that. Habermas and Kant, of course, many people interested in this, and Rawls, Dworkin, and Kant. Now, to some claims, I'm just reading them. I cannot defend them. It's a little autobiographical because I'm sort of reviewing some of my work. Transcendental arguments, you know, this thesis coming from Stroud, cannot achieve their goals without assuming the truth of some idealist or verificationist premise. Nowadays, verificationist, but is it a non-objectionable verificationist like a non-objectionable transcendental idealism? We take transcendental idealism seriously, following Allison. It's not Geyer's approach. It's just we try to make it work as much as we can. Truths of transcendental idealism, paradoxical truths about the relations between human mind and the world, which cannot be said meaningfully, but only shown to speak in a Wittgensteinian mode. The peculiarity of transcendental necessity, insights about the human epistemic predicament when we try to understand the uniqueness of our mindedness at its limits, approach from the inside, and then the costs of detranscendentalization and relativization of transcendental arguments, of moving to pragmatic, naturalistic, and therapeutic options. I read McDowell in a therapeutic, through a therapeutic lens. So here I write from Strawson to Stroud to Jonathan Lear. I have been influenced a lot by Lear's reading, Mark Zaks, Adrian Moore, and others. And now, faculty and researchers, I'm not going to bombard you with all these names. They are available to anyone who is interested in what is happening in Greece. Just you have a look at them. I'm not even going to read them because that will be Greek to you in a way. And you may just be already tired by this sort of exposition. Just look at the names. Some of them are here present tonight. This is just our journal, Deucalion. These are two issues, two special issues on Kant's philosophy with interesting original papers. To mention just one of them, paragraph 59 of the third critique, morality and beauty and the connection, interesting in interpretation of the debate. Okay, so I'm going to just finish like Costas with Zurich to Kant. We are already there, perhaps. We don't want to slide towards Hegel, at least some of us. I mean, this is it inevitable? Maria Elena, in a paper of hers recently, said, I don't think it's inevitable that we move from Kant to Hegel, and I endorse that. So thank you very much for your patience and attention. And I'm going to stop here, just summarizing, just giving you a summary picture. I hope it made sense.
Stelios, thank you so much for this great overview. We can only testify that it's a very good picture of what is happening in Greece today. The list of subjects and the people who attend with the research and the devotion and their engagement to Kantian philosophy and the possibilities that are open to us with it today.
Just one more thing, Dimitri, before you move, because you are interested in philosophy of physics. As you may know, in my department, there is a colleague applying Kantian ideas to contemporary physics. And maybe he should be mentioned.
In the conference of your department 2 years ago, we had a section devoted to Kantian epistemology concerning physics and Kuhn and so on. So this is an ongoing discussion. Yannis, here, our colleague Yannis Pissis, is also working on these subjects. But I will not talk any further about that, but we'll open the floor to anybody who would like to ask questions. We will take some questions now in between the sections, the two sections that we have planned. Then we'll have a very small break of a few minutes, of a couple of minutes, and then we'll go on with the next section. So, please. Yes, Karin.
Yes, thank you so much for these very interesting presentations. And before I ask my question, I would also like to mention that it would be very nice if everyone who has good Wi-Fi and so on can switch on their cameras. Yes, I think especially during the Q&A, it's nice if everyone can see each other. And we forgot to mention this earlier on. Okay, so I was curious about the very beginning of Kant scholarship in Greece. So Kostas, you referred to a researcher called Koumas, who was the first Greek Kantian. And I was wondering how, if you could say a bit more about him. Yeah, so did he study in Germany, for instance, and what did he actually do, and how did he go about spreading Kantianism in Greek, if he did this at all? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. May I answer now immediately? Apparently, yes. Okay. Yes. So, if I have heard you really rightly, it was about Koumas. Well, Koumas has perhaps been the first philosopher in Greece who has learned who has learned Kant and who studied Kant and who has been influenced by Kant. Well, he has lived about 1778 to 1836. He has studied in Germany at the University of Leipzig, I think, and he has been a student of Krug, who was the first successor of Kant at the University of Königsberg. He was really important. I mean, this Koumas was important because he has written, among other things, a full system of philosophy, which was actually who has been influenced by both Kant and Krug. He has also translated in Greek the short or the outline of the history of philosophy of Teneman, a big name. I mean, a voluminous, a history of philosophy of many volumes, but Kumas has translated only the short or the brief, the outline of the history of philosophy of Teneman. So those are the basic data about Kumas. He has not held a university position or chair in Greece at those days. He had been invited to do so, but he preferred to live in other cities. I mean, in a smaller city in Greece, and then he has worked in Trieste. But despite this, he has been important for Greek education. Just another name which I didn't mention because of the shortness of time. There has been also another name before Kumas, whose name is Psalidas, Athanasios Psalidas, about whom there has been the rumor that he has heard Kant himself, that he has studied as a student of Kant himself, but perhaps this rumor is not correct. This is the thing which I would like to say. Thank you very much.
Yes, first Mrs. Kroitoru and then Mr. Morphis.
Yes, thank you. Hi, I have a question for Professor Viridakis. Where do you see the Greek Kantian tradition heading in the future? What do you think are the directions of Kant scholarship in Greece?
In Greece, you mean? In Greece?
Yes.
Yes. Well, I'm optimistic in the sense that there are more and more young people, more and more dissertations, people coming from foreign countries, from abroad, studying with very good specialists abroad. Here in Greece, we are a little limited, as I said, although today we can publish and communicate more easily. And there are these conferences in Greece, like the McDowell conferences. And there are Kant conferences by Greek scholars, which are at a very high level. So I'm optimistic. I cannot say much more. For theoretical philosophy and moral philosophy, there is more, perhaps, production in concerning moral philosophy, practical philosophy, also because of the influence of the law school and the philosophy of law. So, but even in theoretical philosophy, there are some good signs. And for instance, when I came back from the States and I was writing about transcendental arguments, few people were interested in idealism, transcendental idealism as such. But then, you know, Allison's work was known, and now Gardner's book has just been translated. I mean, people read in English, as you know, and so I'm optimistic and hope for the best. But there is also a very strong Hegelian, or at least some versions of Hegelian philosophy in Greece. And Marxism is not as important as it used to be. Marxism and existentialism, they are not that important. There are always the Heideggerians and the Frankfurt people, but there is also good, you know, just standard Kantian work. It is true that some of it is not just going deep in technical issues in scholarship. It's more reception and making Kant work in a contemporary context in an analytic, let's say, spirit. But that's why I call my Kant work as Kantenstein, my Kantenstein. But there are good signs. So that's what I would say. But Mrs. Kroitoru, Professor Kroitoru, had a question also. Yes.
I have to apologize. I was overheard before when I first gave you the floor, but I'm sorry. So please.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to ask Professor Androulidakis. My question concerns the first presentation. I'm interested in the translation. The first translation of Kant, the Critique of Pure Reason, and Grundlegung, and was done by, the name was not mentioned. Who is the name? who belongs the first translation in the years 1904, the beginning of the 20th century.
Would you like to listen the names, or would you like
Yes,
me to...
the name.
Okay,
the name.
excuse me again, excuse me, but
Voras maybe.
Okay, I have been frightened by the pressure of time. So if you like the names, insofar as I know, that the first translator of the, at least a part of the Critique of Pure Reason in Greece, 1904, has been Alexander Pallis. Alexander Pallis.
Pallis. And
yes.
Excuse me, the later one, by the around the 20th century, I understand that there a further translation about the Academic text of Gabe. Who belongs the next translation of the Critique of Pure Reason?
And this, okay, the first was Pallis. The second translation,
yeah, the second one,
been in a publisher Anagnostides, whose name I have to say I don't have now in memory. I should go to my library and search for it.
It's okay. It's okay. Yes.
Well,
yes.
I shall try to memorize.
It was bad, Kostas. It was a bad translation. That's maybe.
Yes, it was not a very good. I think perhaps he was Vagenas, the father of Nassos Vagenas, yes, but it's not very
important. Pallis also, excuse me, of 1904, the first translation is terrible. It is cannot be used. It is a small part.
So, yes,
it is also funny, if I may say. Yes. The word time is not translated as chronos, which is.
Then it is not translated about Academic text as Gabe.
So the next
Academic text as Gabe. And if possible, regarding the reception of Evangelos Moutsopoulos, who was the vice president of the Kant Society in French, is more known in Greece, more appreciated for his Kant's contribution or for his kairos, his own contribution to philosophy?
Well, this is a difficult question. Of course, the answer would be Moutsopoulos is much more important for his own philosophy, for the concept of kairos, you know, the Greek, the ancient concept of kairos, but not only for this, for his own systematic philosophy, and then as a second range, so to speak, for his Kantian contributions. I have just mentioned Moutsopoulos as a Kantian scholar, which was not his, so to speak, his most strong point, so to speak. So for your question, Moutsopoulos has been much more important for other things than for Kant. But he was important because he was the holder of the chair of philosophy at the University of Athens, and he has dominated, so to speak, academic philosophy, and he had also an international presence, and so on. So that's
he has written an interesting book on Kant's aesthetics. I think the title is Forme subjectivité dans l'esthétique kantienne. I think it's
Romanian.
That, you know that.
And he was really good.
He was close to a Romanian philosopher called Tanaze, a Romanian philosopher long ago. Does the name ring a bell? Tanaze.
Constantinoica. Okay. Yes. Thank you very much. Thank you.
If I may add, his book on Brahms is much more well known in comparison to his other works.
I wanted to translate
the public and aesthetic work.
I wanted to translate it into Romanian, but unfortunately I don't know Greek. But Plato's music is a very good one. Right. I translated it in 2004. And as a matter of fact, three books of Moutsopoulos I translated into Romanian. Thank you for your both presentations.
Okay. Other questions, remarks? Okay, if there aren't any at the moment, let me return to Koumas and the origins of Greek Enlightenment, because it's interesting. It's a good question. I don't know the answer anyway. But Kant's reception in Greece was limited to Koumas, and this whole German philosophy was regarded as dark and not useful, because most of the Greek Enlightenment was oriented to Anglo-Saxon empiricism. John Locke was widely received, and so on. Kant came back only after about a century later. So that's an interesting background. I don't know whether one can go further into it at the moment or anyways, but it's a question which is, I think, we should do well to look into that, because it shows a lot about the intellectual situation, the political situation, of course, as well, in the Greek-speaking world on the eve of the Greek Revolution. Because this situation was reversed 150 years later, as we heard, entirely. From nothing, Kantian philosophy or neo-Kantian philosophy became everything in this country. I don't know whether the other colleagues would agree with this, but anyway, I would like to put it to discussion if we have another minute or so.
I agree. Also, the translation that we discussed earlier is very late for Greece. Right. Other major works of early modern European philosophy were translated in the 19th century, not Kant. And in useful translations, not of Kant.
Well, I think my conjecture, I'm not sure, my conjecture is that it was more difficult for the Greek Enlightenment to reconcile Kant with religion compared to Anglo-Saxon empiricism. If you ask me, that is the main reason I see, but I may be wrong. I may well be wrong. The other friends may have another view of this. I would like to hear it. Or
now, Dimitri, your question is about the Greek Enlightenment, basically. What the Greek Enlightenment,
right,
and you are talking about Koumas' time, or even before that. Yes. Yes, it's difficult to tell. I mean, I don't know, but I'm not sure they knew enough. And then German philosophy came in later, and Kostas mentioned the Ionian Academy, and there was an influence from Italy. And the influence from Italy involved the reception of Italian readings of German idealism, which was post-Kantian idealism, basically. So, but Koumas was right from Germany. And in the 19th century, there are not too many people, or 18th century educated in Germany. It was mostly France, I think, or Italy. And then later Germany was dominant. But I don't know enough about the history of the period.
No, you're certainly right. And the point is that this reception of German idealism and German philosophy over Italy had a romantic taint to it. Yes. It was also going with the times. So the Kantian way of doing philosophy was not could not be well received. The moment had passed, I think.
But something else which we should also say concerning the Greek Orthodox Church later is that there is not enough sympathy or understanding for Kantian enlightenment in the Greek Orthodox Church, to be sure. And there are all kinds of misconceptions about Kant's understanding of religion, and also the Enlightenment. The book, Kant's book on religion, was not studied properly. The theology department, they don't like Kant. Like with Kant's moral philosophy, all the misconceptions and preconceptions have been propagated. thing.
That would be also my explanation. I agree with you entirely. Yes, yes, yes.
Dimitris, sorry to interrupt, but can I suggest that we move to the next two talks immediately, because otherwise we might run out of time.
Okay. We'll do so. So now we welcome Dr. Marianella Carambaciu. She completed her doctorate at the University of the Humboldt University in Berlin about Kant and his immediate reception in mostly in the German-speaking world, and she has distinguished herself since then with a number of publications, conference talks, and of course a lot of teaching. She now, at the moment, she teaches at the University of Crete. So without any further ado, I would like to ask her to take the floor.
Yeah, so thank you so much. Yes, I teach at the University of Crete, the stronghold for Kantians, but I'm also doing a postdoc at the University of Athens. So I have a double affiliation right now. Okay, so let me share my screen. Can you, oh, just give me a second, because I believe I did. Okay, you can see it, right? But it's not in the presenter's view. Okay, that's right? Okay, so you see the title of my talk, Intellect and Reality on Kant's Platonism. We're now moving to the second section. So the first part was about the reception of Kant in Greece, and now it's a kind of different perspective, how much Greece we can find in Kant. And if you read this title, you might think one possible interpretation would be that I'm going to speak about Kant's direct engagement with Plato, or perhaps you could think that I'm going to focus on things in Kant where it's clear that Kant is engaging with Plato indirectly. For example, in both Kant's practical philosophy and theoretical philosophy, reason and ideas play a prominent role. And ideas were called like this precisely to signal their connection to a Platonic conception of the intellect. And that was also mentioned in the first part of the talk, for example, that Stelios Viridakis, in his own interpretation of Plato, supports the idea, upholds the idea that there is some sort of Platonism in Kant. But this is established on the grounds of views about what I say higher intellect. I mean reason and ideas. Now, I'm not going to focus on this. So what I want to do in this short talk is to focus on the lower intellect. And with this, I mean the understanding and its representation on the categories, which are called so in order to honor Aristotle, not Plato. Although I do think the things I'm going to say have some connections also with Kant's account of ideas, and perhaps we can talk about this in the discussion. But in any case, what I want to do is to very sketchily defend the idea that Kant endorses a Platonic conception of intellect and reality when it comes precisely to the understanding and its categories. So what do we mean when we're talking about a Platonic conception of intellect and reality? What I have in mind is this stark contrast that we find in Plato, but also in other Greek thinkers like Parmenides, with respect to the senses and the intellect, as far as their access to reality is concerned. You have the senses, we can only give you access to seemings and appearances, not the way the things are. And by contrast, you have the intellect, which is the route to the way things really are, the ontos, onta, something like this. And perhaps more polemically put, in the Prolegomena, Kant writes, the thesis of all genuine idealists from the Eleatic school up to Bishop Berkeley is contained in this formula. All cognition through the senses and experience is nothing but sheer illusion. and there is truth only in the ideas of pure understanding and reason. Now, of course, saying that Kant endorses some form of a Platonic conception of the intellect and reality is no news. In the inaugural dissertation, the very title, De Mundi, pays tribute to precisely this Platonic theme. And Kant writes very explicitly that through the senses, we represent only things as they appear, while things which are intellectual are representation of things as they are. And this is standardly characterized by Kant's commentators as the Platonic conception of the relationship between intellect and reality. But as is also well known, Kant, the critical Kant, abandons the view of the inaugural dissertation. So the inaugural dissertation has this peculiar proto-critical status. It is already critical, we could say, with respect to sensibility. All the arguments there about time and space reappear in the transcendental aesthetic, but it is pre-critical with respect to the intellect. And according to a very widespread reading, the Copernican turn, which is takes place in the transition from this work to the first critique, is the idea that Kant understands that somehow the sensibility and intellect function in parallel ways. So just as much forms of intuition, there are forms of the mind projected by the mind. Something equal is the case with respect to the understanding and its categories. And so that would mean that the transition from the inaugural dissertation to the first critique would imply an abandonment of the Platonic conception of intellect and reality, the way I presented it before. But I think that there are some interesting passages in the critical Kant which suggest otherwise. And I believe that they have not received the discussion and attention they deserve. That is, they haven't received the attention they deserve as evidence for Kant's proximity to what I term a Platonic conception of the intellect, because otherwise they are well-known passages and central. So here's one passage that's from the B deduction, the pinnacle of the critical enterprise. And there, among lots of difficult things happening, we also have this theory of self-affection. According to, and Kant, in the course of establishing this account, he tells us that we recognize ourselves as appearances, not things in themselves. Now, I have here a quote which is long and dark, and I only want to call attention to the underlined parts, because I think Kant says something striking. So I'm just reading the underlined parts. I cognize myself as an object, not as I am for the understanding, but rather as I appear to myself. I think that this is interesting, that here it's clear that he wants to draw the distinction between representing something as an object, as an appearance, and representing something as a thing in itself. And he formulates the same point, that I represent something as a thing in itself, by saying I represent it as it is for the understanding. And a bit later, when he also explains why he thinks that we cannot recognize ourselves as things themselves, but merely as appearances, the justification is interesting. So I'm just reading this second part of the quote. The I is subject to a limiting condition that it calls inner sense, which can make that combination intuitable only in accordance with temporal relations that lie entirely outside of the concepts of the understanding proper, and that can therefore still cognize itself merely as it appears to itself with regard to an intuition. I think what's interesting here is that as a reason why we cannot cognize ourselves as appearances, as things themselves, but merely as appearances, is cited the limiting condition of time. And what is also interesting in the passage is that Kant stresses that there is a contrast between inner sense and time, and the concepts of the understanding proper. Now, all this is dark, but there's something similar happening in a passage in the Anthropology, which is not so central in itself, but I think it says in simpler language the same thing that we saw in the B deduction. And again, we have some striking formulations. So it's again the view that we can only cognize ourselves as appearances, not things in themselves. And here's how the view is framed and how it is justified. I nevertheless cognize myself only as I appear to myself, not as a thing in itself, for this cognition still depends on the temporal condition, which is not a concept of the understanding, consequently not mere spontaneity. I think it's interesting, again, the justification why I cannot cognize myself as a thing in itself, but merely as appearance, is because time is not a concept of the understanding. So just to recap, what is interesting about these passages is that in these passages, we have Kant discussing different powers of the mind. Sensibility on the one hand, understanding on the other hand, and their representations, forms of intuition and pure concepts. And what he's interested in is how they're related to issues of mind independence. To what extent these powers of the mind give us access to a world of appearances or things themselves, yes or no. And what is striking about the passages is that in both cases, Kant contrasts Kant contrasts the two cases. Kant contrasts the way the relationship plays out in each case. So in the case of sensibility, Kant basically tells us that we represent objects as appearances because sensibility is unlike the understanding. This is how I understand all these formulations where Kant tells us time is not a concept, pure concept of the understanding. And as I've said, also in this respect, it's also interesting that we have this formulation that representing something as a thing in itself seems to coincide with representing something as it is for the understanding. And there's also a further passage which I think is relevant here, a very famous and much discussed passage, the very first official definition of transcendental realism and idealism in the entire critique, in the fourth paralogism in the A edition. It is there that Kant tells us that what the opponent says, transcendental realism, according to which time is this. So I read the beginning of the quote: to this idealism is opposed transcendental realism, which regards space and time as something given in themselves, independent of our sensibility. So far, so good. But I think what's interesting is, again, what happens next. So Kant tells us here, the transcendental realist, therefore, represents outer appearances, if the reality is conceded, as things in themselves, which would exist independently of us and our sensibility, and thus would also be outside us according to pure concepts of the understanding. Again, we have this interesting formulation that something would be outside us according to pure concepts of the understanding. And here we are touching transcendental realism. According to transcendental realism, the objects we are talking about representing are obviously things themselves. It's the very passage where Kant formulate the distinction. So we have Kant here again telling us that the representation of an object as it is in itself coincides with the representation we would have of it if we could access it by means of the understanding alone. Now, of course, you could say, as far as this passage is concerned, that things are very complicated because here Kant articulates the opponent's view, the transcendental realist view. So you could say that it's not clear that he's speaking his own mind when he brings close to one another the idea of representing something according to the pure concepts of the understanding and representing something as a thing in itself. But given that what Kant is saying here ties in very well with what we saw before, where Kant is obviously speaking his own mind, then this means that something very interesting is happening in this very central passage where Kant define his doctrine for the first time in the entire critique. So I do think that all these passages suggest that there is a strong and interesting sense in which Kant never abandoned Platonic conception with regard to the relationship between the intellect and reality. Now, of course, this begs the obvious question, in what sense does Kant abandon the pre-critical view of the inaugural dissertation then? Because it's clear that there's a shift between the inaugural dissertation and the critique. And also, I mean, I began the talks citing Kant from Prolegomena, where he presents this, the principle of the genuine idealists, the Eleatics, up until Bishop Berkeley. But then he goes on and he writes this: the principle that governs and determines my idealism throughout is, on the contrary, all cognition of things out of mere pure understanding or pure reason is nothing but sheer illusion, and there is truth only in experience. So he clearly has a problem with these genuine idealists. And the question is, how can one do justice to this if we accept that Kant holds a Platonic conception of intellect and reality? Now, this is a huge topic, but I believe that there are already some discussions which give us an answer to this. And what I have in mind is basically Lucy Allais' view, which I think is the more radical view in out there with respect to the categories as representing the mind-independent world. But I believe that this is a radicalization of some thoughts that also share the spirit of Karl Emmerich's critique of short arguments for idealism, and I think it also some work by Eric Watkins is relevant here. And the whole idea here is that we should challenge the idea that there is such a stark parallel between the sensibility and the understanding in Kant. And how can you explain the rupture between the pre-critical and critical Kant then? An answer, and I think this is the answer I would go for, is to say that the major innovation of the first critique is that cognition has two necessary conditions, both sensibility and understanding. So you need both concepts and intuitions. This means that cognition cannot sidestep the contribution of sensibility. And since, given Kant's conception of sensibility and all this theory of time and space, what sensibility gives you is appearances, then there is a sense in which you cannot cognize things themselves, according to the critical Kant. But what drives this conclusion, and this is what I'm pressing, is the combination of these two things, 1 and 2. But this is compatible with holding Platonic view of the relationship between intellect and reality. So the way I see it, the task of the understanding and its categories is to bring us into touch with the mind-independent world. So they're not just concepts. So of course, there are concepts that are a priori and have an a priori origin, but they're not concepts that are meant to just project things onto the world. Now, according to the whole picture, it doesn't really or fully succeed in this. It's delicate how to frame this. Because it relies on sensibility, which provides it with appearances, not things themselves. But still, I think that according to this picture, in applying the categories, we do learn some things about the mind-independent world. And so I think this entire picture is compatible with Kant's criticism of the Eleatics. And there's a sense in which Kant does not abandon the Platonic conception. And I think that these passages that I've cited are weighty evidence for this. As I've said, the view that there is a strong dissimilarity between sensibility and intellect is not new. But I think that these passages are very good evidence for this type of view. And I find it interesting that we do not discuss them that much. Now, of course, coming to toward the end, this kind of interpretation raises a host of challenges. if you look at the transcendental analytic and the project of the deduction, the whole project about the categories seems to be crucially informed by Kant's distinction between appearances and things themselves. He keeps saying that the conclusion is only about appearances, not things themselves. He's also presenting the view in a stronger way, namely that it's premised on the idea that we have a distinction between appearances and things themselves. So one obvious challenge for this type of reading is how one makes sense of the project of the deduction and the role that the distinction between appearance and things themselves is supposed to play there. And the related question is the critical Kant critical in any way if we really accept what I've said here? Now, there are some things to say about this, and these are topics for another day or for a discussion. And so I do think that there are some responses available. But in any case, even if I did a very bad job in convincing you that there is some Greece in Kant in this respect, you can still see my contribution as a valuable contribution to the first part of our section, namely Kant in Greece. I mean, I've spent a lot of time studying Kant outside Greece, but still I'm Greek. I was taught Plato long before I ever had a chance to read Kant. So my take here perhaps gives you a hint as to what happens when texts by Prussian philosophers fall into the hands of Greeks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria Elena. So the first thing you proved is that Kant is right in his conception of the cosmopolitan conscience. So it's common to all of us in all the world. No? Kant's cosmopolitanism speaks for it, I think. Okay, so thank you very much for this very interesting talk and the bundle of questions that you put. Okay, the discussion is open.
No, after my talk.
Right, I'm sorry. Right, I'm sorry, Yanis. We said that we will complete the talks and then the.
We will have time.
Sorry, yes, you're right. Of course. So now, without any further ado, very quickly, Professor Yannis Pissis from the University of Crete, the philosophy department there, will talk to us about his own view of the presence of Greek philosophy in Kant. Very quickly on Professor Pissis, he has written his dissertation on Kant's dialectic and logic, and since then he has contributed mainly to in this vein philosophy of science, logic, epistemology, Leibniz, and so on. I will not bother you any longer with that, and I will give the floor to him.
So thank you very much. Can you see the screen?
Not yet.
Oh. Why? Oops. Okay, now you can see that. So yes, my subject, we stay in that subject, Greece in Kant, ancient Greece in Kant. My subject will be what Kant had to say on the dawn of philosophy, on the beginnings of philosophy. Why is that interesting? Actually, because there is a tendency in the last years to present Kant as responsible for the formation of a Greco-centric view on the beginnings of philosophy and a Eurocentric view on the history of philosophy in total, as responsible for the exclusion of Africa and Asia from the philosophical canon, an exclusion that took place around 1800. The most ambitious and systematic work is this book here, Peter K.J. Park, Africa, Asia, and the History of Philosophy, Racism in the Formation of the Philosophical Canon. Why should Kant be responsible? I mean, he was no historian of philosophy. On the one hand, because of what he said on the subject in his lectures after 1780, but on the other hand, because of his systematic conception of an a priori history of philosophy or philosophical history of philosophy or history of pure reason. The idea is that traditional doxography was inclusive. It had room for everybody. the evil and the wrong, the righteous and the unrighteous. A priori history is exclusive. That's the idea. It is an a priori construction that takes in what was a necessary position, a necessary step of human reason, and leaves out what was mere doxa, mere opinion. But then does non-European philosophy have to be excluded? No, and if you look here at chapter 4 in this book, chapter 5, systematic inclusion of Africa and Asia from under absolute identity, Park discusses Friedrich Ast and Tadej Anselm Rixner's histories of philosophy after Kant, who follow that paradigm of an a priori history of philosophy and discuss the philosophy of the Indians and also the Chinese, the Tibetans, and so on, as beginning of philosophy. So Park admits that a priori history of philosophy is a scheme that can be filled with different contents. However, if I understand his position correctly, the conception of a priori history is, so to say, structurally Eurocentric or Grecocentric, because it is structurally exclusive. It separates the necessary history of reason from the contingent stories. Something has to be left out, so it is suited to serve a narrative that was driven by racist motives. Non-European traditions of thought do not belong to the history of philosophy proper, to the history of pure reason. With respect to Kant, this critique is meant to undermine his logical and moral universalism. It would mean that Kant's universal human reason is not truly universal, that his conception of reason systematically represses non-European thought. I will argue against such a view. The first point would be that Kant's conception of an a priori history of philosophy cannot be blamed for that shift in the historiography of philosophy, the exclusion of the pre-Greek origins. That development was independent of Kant. The second point, that systematically there is nothing in Kant's conception of philosophy or the history of reason that excludes non-European thought and necessarily places the birth of philosophy in Greece. Although it is true that in his lectures after 1780, Kant holds the position that philosophy was born in Greece. I will discuss briefly 3 lectures of Kant, 2 on logic and 1 on metaphysics. The first, the Logic Philippi, 1772. Here, Kant puts the birth of philosophy down to a revolution of the understanding. Philosophy started when people started practicing the sciences and philosophizing independently of the priests of organized religion. That happened in China and Greece. China has to be acknowledged as the fountain of the sciences, the spring of the sciences, the Quelle der Wissenschaften. Kant sees the limits of Chinese thought in its dependence from the state and the aims of government. In Greece, he thinks the condition was given for philosophy to flourish, and that condition was freedom, total absence of external constraint. Kant points out an analogy between the Greek city-states and England in modern times in that respect. The other science of pure reason, mathematics, besides philosophy, mathematics emerged in Egypt, according to Kant, and was only perfected in Greece. In general, Kant discusses here in this section on the history of philosophy, the depth of Greek thought to the ancient civilizations of Africa and Asia. He refers to the Chaldeans, the Persians, and the educational trips of Pythagoras to India, as was usual in older histories of philosophy. Of course, Kant stresses the shortcomings of ancient Eastern thought, but he's no less critical of the 7 sages of Greece, for example. In order for philosophy and the sciences to be born, a rupture was required, a break was required, a revolution of the understanding. Why did that revolution occur in China and Greece and not somewhere else? Kant seeks to explain that fact with reference to the special historical conditions in the social and political formation of those countries. So that was Kant 1772. In what way do we have a different picture in the lectures after 1780? The logic Pöllisch. Also the chapter on the history of philosophy, 1780 to 1782, this lecture. It's the main source for the logic that was published later by Yeshe. And it is the chapter on the history of philosophy is obviously the source for the passage in the Yeshe logic, which people use to cite as evidence for Kant's Grecocentrism. The tone here is indeed different. Eigentlich, strictly speaking, I would say, only the Greeks began to philosophize. The same goes for mathematics. The Greeks were the first real philosophers, eigentlich, philosophers, as well as the first real mathematicians. Kant stresses the rupture between Egyptian wisdom and Greek science, and not the depth of the latter to the former, as he did in 1772. However, Kant acknowledges that philosophy emerged out of some preliminary work and that the Eastern people went ahead. Above all, for Kant, one cannot know for sure when and where the philosophical spirit came up. Wann und wo der philosophische Geist entsprungen sei. All empirical assessments on the beginnings of philosophy are uncertain. In the public logic, the logic Yeshe, this sentence has changed. One cannot know for sure when and where among the Greeks the philosophical spirit came up. Wann und wo unter den Griechen. At the end of the page. It seems to be an addition of Yeshe, and it is not innocent. So why just the Greeks and not anymore the Chinese and the Greeks? Why did Kant change his mind? The lecture Metaphysik Volkmann of the fall semester 1784-1785, which includes an extended part on the history of metaphysics, can give us a clue. Here, the exaltation of the Greeks and the belittlement of the contributions of the other ancient peoples is even clearer than in the logic Kölitz. Non-Greek ancient philosophy was not philosophy proper, keine rechte Philosophie. No other nation developed a logic. The Greeks have invented everything. A new author, a neue Autor, has remarked correctly that it is wrong to derive the science of the Greeks from the Egyptians. Who was that new author? According to the editors of the volume of the Academy edition, it is Dietrich Tiedemann. He would soon come out as a fierce critic of Kant in 1785, über die Natur der Metaphysik, his anti-Kant. His approach to the historiography of philosophy had also nothing to do with Kant's conception of a priori history. He sought to trace empirically the groundbreaking ideas in the history of philosophy and to establish empirically the progress in that history. Kant refers to Tiedemann's book. Why can I not anymore move my screen? Here. The first philosophers of Greece, Life and Systems of Orpheus, Pherekides, Thales, and Pythagoras of 1780. The title means, of course, the first philosophers of Greece were the first philosophers, period. In that passage, Kant indeed goes on to discuss Orpheus, Pherekides, and Pythagoras, so it is convincing that it is this book he refers to. Why is that important that this was Kant's source? I will discuss it in a minute. Just one more remark to the Metaphysik Volkmann with regard to the language of philosophy. But Kant states that the Greek language and among the modern languages, the German language, are more suited to express abstract philosophical concepts. And that statement is often cited as evidence of cultural racism. But for Kant, there is no inherent value in these two languages. Kant is very clear that the language of philosophy is an artificial language. Gradually and strenuously, people had to form words devoid of figurative connotations. If one cannot isolate the concept from the associated images, one can never think purely and without mistakes. Wenn man den Begriff nicht von Bildern absondern kann, so wird man niemals rein und fehlerfrei denken können. So in the beginning, the Greek language was almost completely unsuitable as a vehicle of pure thought. Kant credits Aristotle with a decisive contribution to the formation of the philosophical language and terminology. As for the German language, according to Kant, it is not some Proto-Germanic words that are privileged, not at all. On the contrary, some artificial German words created as direct translations of Latin composite terms by the first teachers of Christian religion in Germany, are those that are suited to express abstract concepts. That is his idea. I leave that aside. Back to Tiedemann. What is the point? Should we say it was not Kant's fault? He is not to blame. He was misled by Tiedemann. No, Kant is certainly responsible for having more or less adopted the narrative of Tiedemann and of other authors of his time. It was the new trend then. I just want to stress that the shift in Kant's position does not seem to have been necessitated or even motivated by his transcendental philosophy or by his conception of an a priori history of philosophy. So the crucial question, I think, is the following. Did Kant have a systematic reason to abandon his view of 1772, that indeed a revolution of thought was required? It happened in China, it happened in Greece, it could have happened anywhere under specific conditions. Did he have a systematic reason to abandon this view and embrace the view that the only revolution took place in Greece? Does Kant have an argument to support the Greco-centric thesis, an argument for what counts as the beginning of philosophy, a criterion for what constitutes proper philosophy and distinguishes it from the non-philosophy that preceded it? In the case of mathematics, Kant does indeed have an argument. The breakthrough was the discovery of demonstration, the notion of proof. Kant explains that in these lectures, but also in the foreword to the B edition of the Critique of Pure Reason. It might have been Thales or somebody else, the one who first deduced the properties of an isosceles triangle, not by observing and comparing figures, but by a strict demonstration from the construction of the concept, a demonstration necessarily valid for all such triangles. Whoever it was for Kant, when and where, his inspiration amounted to a revolution. Since then, mathematics travels the secure path of a science. Before that, it was left groping for a long time, chiefly among the Egyptians. That was Kant's idea actually already in the lecture of 1772, that we saw that the Greeks perfected the Egyptian science of mathematics. In the case of philosophy, according to the logic Perlich, the breakthrough seems to be, my question is there such a, can we determine such a rupture, such a break? The breakthrough seems to be the use of reason in abstracto as opposed to the use of reason in concreto. Philosophy is born when people start thinking in concepts and not in images, when thought puts off the cloth of poetry and uses prosaic words that express abstract concepts without the aid of images that allude to concrete beings. In other words, the breakthrough consists in the recognition of the merely logical nature of abstract concepts. Who was the first to fully recognize that? Not Pherekides for Kant, not Pythagoras, not even Plato. Pythagoras and Plato still admitted, according to Kant, intelligible beings to which universal concepts refer to, objects that are given to us in intellectual intuition, as Kant explains in his essay on a newly arisen noble or aristocratic tone in philosophy, von einem neuerdings erhobenen vornehmen Ton in der Philosophie. Pythagoras and Plato accepted intellectual intuition because they were led astray by mathematics. Mathematics has to do with the universal in concreto. Mathematical concepts like that of the isosceles triangle can be constructed in pure intuition. Philosophy, on the contrary, has to do with the universal in abstracto. And in that essay, he praises Aristotle, of course, against Plato. So should we conclude that philosophy begins with Aristotle, the exquisitely prosaic philosopher, as Kant terms him? If yes, it would mean something very different than to say philosophy begins with the Greeks. It would mean something like Aristotle was the true founder of metaphysics, certainly after some indispensable preliminary work by Plato, other Greeks, other civilizations. If we do not want to draw the line at such a late point, and I do not think that was Kant's intention, to say it starts with Aristotle, then we do not have some other mark. Kant does not give us any argument. In order to say the history of philosophy starts here among the Greeks, what was before belongs to the prehistory. And anyway, for Kant, philosophy to his days was still actually left groping. The revolution that would be equivalent to what Thales did for mathematics is what the Critique of Pure Reason actually aspires to bring about. Philosophy as science, the system of philosophy, would be possible after the Critique. So strictly speaking, everything that preceded the Critique Lao Tzu, the Egyptians, Plato and Aristotle, as well as Descartes, belongs in that sense to the prehistory of philosophy. Then what is the task of a philosophical or a priori approach to the history of philosophy? Kant gives a brief outline in the last chapter of the Critique of Pure Reason, chapter, the history of pure reason. I will close with that, with a few words. The task of this history is to examine that prehistory from a transcendental standpoint, the standpoint of the nature of pure reason, and to discover in those ruins, as Kant says, in those ruins, some necessary order, an a priori logical order. It is not a tool to separate proper philosophy from imperfect philosophy. We have to do, I would say, with ruins anyway, in any time, any place. And the philosophical approach or transcendental approach, as opposed to an empirical approach to the history of philosophy, is for Kant the condition for what we would term a rational reconstruction of those ruins. To follow that, we can, under that condition, we can determine reasons for passing from one position or one form of thought to another, and we do not just report that passing or present some external causes. In that brief outline, Kant lists three pairs of opposition, which correspond, in that last chapter of the Critique, which correspond to the revolutions in the history of reason, in the history of metaphysics. The first pair, I would say, is actually the one we encountered. One party ascribes merely logical reality to the concepts of the understanding. I modify the English translation there. It was only logical for them, the reality of the concepts of the understanding. The other party, mystical reality via an intellectual intuition of corresponding intelligible objects. I would say it is the same pair. Logical nature of abstract concepts, their mystical nature versus a mystical nature. So the recognition of the merely logical reality of concepts was for Kant a major breakthrough in the history of reason. And here Kant assigns the logical position to Epicurus, the mystical to Plato. But anyway, both positions are for Kant grounded in the nature of reason. They both belong to the history of pure reason. As I said, a priori history is not a tool to exclude positions that are deemed flawed. So my overall conclusion is simple. I hope it has become clear that I don't not think that there is anything in that systematic conception of Kant that makes it structurally exclusive and incompatible with a truly cosmopolitan view on the history of philosophy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yanis. Okay, so I hope we have still have a few minutes left for questions and answers and discussion. So please.
On both talks.
On both talks, yes, of course. Yes, yes, Kostas.
Well, I would like to say something supplementing what Yanis John has just said. I would say that this view of Kant about the dawn of the history of philosophy, that it began with Greece and so on, I think this is the, we could say, the regular, the normal, the canonical view. I would like just to remind you to remind you Hegel, who in his history of philosophy, just frankly or openly, begins the history of philosophy with Greece. And he, of course, he devotes about 30 pages in the 3 volumes work on the history of philosophy. He devotes 30 pages on the so-called Oriental philosophy and says this is just the preliminary. I mean, Hegel says, oh, the Oriental philosophy, Chinese, Korean, and so on, is just the preliminary. But the real philosophy is beginning with Greece. And you all know, of course, the famous beginning. Listening the name Greece, we all feel very familiar, and we are just the sailors who after the storms in the ocean, we are approaching the coast and say, oh, coast, this is our fatherland, and so on. I mean, I would just like to say that the view of Kant is the normal, the regular one. It's not, is neither Eurocentric or something else. Thank you very much.
Very briefly, it was not a canonical view in the 18th century before that period. And so that was my whole point, that people say Kant is responsible for that view. The older histories of philosophy have long chapters on the Indians, the Chinese, even if they have not studied them, but it was canonical to start with the ancient Eastern civilizations and not later. So my point was that although it starts at that time, it does not start with Kant, it does not start with his systematic conception of the history of Hurism. That was my whole point, but please, we have other
yes, let me point out very briefly that most histories of philosophy, even during Kant's time, started with the Old Testament and then the New Testament. That was the beginning for philosophy. That was also a possibility at the time. But we may come back to this later. Professor Proietoru, please.
Thank you. I wanted to Maria Elena say a couple of words. I deal sometimes with this relation, Plato and Kant. It's true. Plato appears in Kant's work as much as Newton, maybe, but not only in his pre-critical and critical works, but in his post-critical works as well. In Opus Posthumum, he deals with Plato, and explicit and implicitly concerning cognition, soul, and God. But what is important in Opus Posthumum is that he says that the understanding is not appropriate for God. The reason as well, because is a faculty, an intermediate faculty acting through reasoning, but mens is most appropriate. This is coming from the Greek philosophy. So, and thank you for the rest, and for Yanni pieces as well, but I have no comment, just for Maria Elena. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Other questions? Yes, Mrs. Pellegrin, please.
Well, I have questions for Maria Elena too. I have 3 very short questions. The first one is in relation to the distinction between sensibility and understanding. I tended to interpret that Kant understands this relationship in a very anti-Platonistic way, from a very naive reading of Plato, particularly because for Plato there is a gradualism from sensibility to intellectual knowledge, whereas for Kant there is a difference not only in degree but also in kind. So I thought that in this sense, there is a difference and a deep contrast, well, with traditional rationalism, but also with a Platonistic point of view, in the sense that while for Plato, we can find a degree from sensible cognition to intellectual cognition, for Kant, there is a gap, so as to put it. Well, I have 3 questions. I don't know if you want me to put like the 3 all together or like one each time.
You can put it together because I don't have a good answer to the first one, so I have to think a lot about this. I mean, he clearly says that about Leibniz. So of course, I mean, it's very clear that this is a complaint with Leibniz. But then, of course, there would be interesting questions to ask whether this is indeed also the Platonic, the view Plato. So I'm not so expert in that, but I would be inclined to say that's not absolutely true that what holds for Leibniz also holds for Plato. So part of my reaction would be there to say that perhaps there's a gap in Plato too.
Okay, thank you very much. The second one is a curiosity that I have because I have just read a paper claiming that Kant did not read Plato, but read Plato through Burke. So that he did not have access straight away to Plato's reading. And I was wondering whether this was a fact, that if it's under discussion, if it's, so I didn't know, like, if it was like something that is under discussion, or if it's a fact that Kant did not read Plato, but when he talks about Plato, he's talking about Burke.
Yeah, again, I'm the worst person to discuss this because this is the thing I'm trying to see from a systematic perspective when we really think about from philosophical perspective. I mean, we know in general that he didn't know very well history of philosophy. So, so in that sense, if this is but I really, that's an extremely interesting question. And actually, I do want to think more about this and see the reception because, as I've said, also pointed in my talk, there is a problem for my view because it's very clear that a lot of passages Kant speaks also in a negative way about Plato in the very famous letter to Hertz, I mean, where he frames the whole problem about the categories. He says clearly that he doesn't want to go in the direction of Plato, so he speaks of him. And so in that sense, it's very important to see how he understands the Platonic view, because this puts constraints also on how we should interpret him. But I don't have, again, a very good answer there. So.
No, but I understand. Thank you very much. And the third question is in relation to the your understanding of the concept of thing itself. You presented the concept of thing itself as the correlate of an archetypical understanding. So I was wondering whether you were committed to this kind of reading of the concept of thing itself, you know, and how do you see this problem with the Kantian point of view? As you showed, there are passages that can lead on this direction, now to understand the thing itself as the correlates of how an intellectual, a pure intellectual and intuitive understanding would know. But I don't know if you were like committed to this reading of the concept of thing itself or just presented some aspect that would be related to Platonic reading. Like, how do you see this problem?
Again, that's a difficult question because I'm not entirely sure whether I would agree that this is the correlate of the intuitive understanding. I mean, you could say very neutrally that thinking itself just means a thing in itself. So a thing not in relation to other things, including minds. So a first understanding was, just to characterize the metaphysical terms, it's the mind-independent world. And then there is a second question, how do you have access, cognitive access to that? Then it seems to me, I mean, I think this is an interesting thing also about the Greek conception. I think Eckhart first discusses this at some point where he discusses the distinction between intellectual intuition and intuitive understanding, that the Greeks have different conceptions. So there is this conception of the intuitive understanding, so in the sense, you need the intuitive understanding, God, something like this form of intellect to have access to the mind-independent world. But there is also a conception where it just means to really cognize the mind-independent world, even without reference to the divine mind. And I was thinking that you might be neutral there. So, but again, that's a huge topic. Also so I don't want to commit myself to the idea that that the thing in itself, the term means that. But when it comes to who can cognize it really as a thing in itself, yes, it should be an intuitive understanding. But that would be about the cognition in a very demanding way, where you really see all the properties of the thing.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Mr. Gadris, please.
Oh, thank you. Hello. Thank you for both talks. They were really interesting. Yannis, we're in the same department, so I know Yannis, not Maria Elena. If I may use the toneniko, the singular, okay. Thank you for this very provocative talk. I mean, it never occurred to me that Kant would be siding with Plato in anything, but I found it really interesting. I have a question. Are the categories of the understanding like ideas or archetypes of things? I'm not sure I can follow. I don't see the link. You mentioned Kant's dissertation, where he does say what you showed very rightly, that the categories of understanding point to the archetype of things. That's God. But he takes a lot of pain showing after 1772 that they just reflect the way that we actually think. Because, and we see that already in the Critique of Pure Reason. I mean, the categories reflect our logical ways of our judgments. So I'm not sure if we are to interpret the categories along the lines of Platonic ideas, because for me, they are just the reflection of the logical uses in our judgments. So they are pretty much human, just like sensibility is. So I missed that point. So I'm not sure where the link is.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Again, that's a huge question. So, I mean, archetypal things. I mean, this is why I tried, as I've said, again, I'm not an expert on Plato, and that would be extremely interesting, I think, for my type of project to really think about Plato at some point seriously. But my first reaction is to say that I wouldn't, I mean, I used a very weak understanding of Platonic view of the intellect and reality. All I said is whether the intellect gives you access to the mind-independent world. So I don't want it, so it's a very weak understanding where I wouldn't get all the Platonic baggage about archetypes of things. So I don't have to, so this is, it's meant in this very weak sense, and the way also Kant uses it polemically in Prolegomena. And then the question is, as I understand it, the Platonic view would tell you that through the categories, you somehow describe properties of the mind-independent world, whereas the non-Platonic view would deny this. This is how I understand the debate. And there, I would say my view is, of course, then you need a whole reading of what's happening in the critique. I agree that the categories are derived from the forms of judgment, and they're just a priori concepts that we bring in as subjects in the synthesis of intuitions and things like that. But the twist, the way I see it in the idea, is that through this synthesis, you're aspiring to reconstruct the mind-independent world. So there is a sense in which the acts of combination, they stem from the understanding and the subject, but there is this lack of parallel, that you do not introduce a layer of mind dependence in this way. What you're trying to do is to reconstruct the way the world is. And perhaps a last thing about the ideas, I think there is an interesting thing to think about their connection with the Platonic ideas and the categories. And it's the following thing. So it's very clear that the ideas in Kant, ideas of reason, at least some of them have as objects things in themselves. Think God, for example, it's the object of the theological idea. And also it's clear that Kant thinks that the ideas, in a sense, are the superlative of the categories. So somehow they're derived from the categories in this superlative form. And I think that if you believe that the categories merely bring in the concepts of the subject in opposition to the mind-independent world, I think it's harder to explain the transition that Kant sees between reason and understanding. Whereas I believe that if you think that there is this connection to the mind-independent world, even at the level of categories, you have a more, I think, coherent conception of Kant's conception of the intellect, comprising both lower and higher intellect as reason and understanding. So that would be my first response.
Thank you.
Okay. Further questions, please. Professor Protoru, would you like to take the word again? You can
No,
raise your hand.
no technical problem. No,
Okay.
no, thank you.
Okay.
It's enough.
Okay. Are there any other remarks, or I don't know how much time you have left?
I have we are already
Over the time.
exceeded the time limit, but
okay. I don't know. How would you like to proceed? Because there are many things to discuss, and it would be nice to also to give people the chance to chat among themselves about Kant,
what was the idea? If
and the world at large.
Yes, so we will have an informal part of the session, we can do this after the recording stops. And I don't know if there are further questions. We would have time for one more. If not, we can close it by.
I have one last question,
then please.
very briefly, to Maria Elena. What do you mean? I'm not sure I understand the point. When you talk about how the world is, in what sense? Because Kant said explicitly that is sein is kein reales Prädikat. So what do you mean by is?
I mean,
Sein is no real predicate.
I'm confused by this. I mean, sure. I mean, the ontological argument, of course, I mean, this plays a major role. But sure, Kant uses the ease. It plays a major role also in the deduction. Is the whole idea and the copula and how this works. So, I would say,
but not as a real predicate.
It means it's not a real predicate in the sense that it doesn't extend our concept, but not that, of course, we do use it. So I'm not entirely sure I understand how this.
No, we use it, but I mean the main point in the refutation of the existence of the ontological proof of the existence of God. The point of the refutation is that is no real predicate. So you cannot claim in this way that God exists.
Yeah, this.
So in what way would the world exist?
Yeah,
if God doesn't exist in this sense.
Yeah, that's in opposition to the idea that somehow this existence should be part of the concept of the highest being. So this is how I understand it, but it seems to me that otherwise, of course, Kant uses the ease, and it's, as I've said, I mean, I'm just repeating myself that I see it as, I don't see how he departs in this way from the way we standardly say things like this. And as I've said, I think it's interesting that the whole idea about what it means, for example, to say the difference between judgments of perception and judgments of experience, they all have to do with the difference that in one case you say, I feel P, I feel that the luggage I'm carrying is heavy, whereas in the other case you're saying it is heavy. So it seems to be quite crucial in the whole account, also of the categories.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much. I think we may go on now to the party.
So thank you so much, and please join me in thanking the Greek Kant group for this wonderful session. I think it was very good. And you're all welcome to join in 2 weeks. We will have the Turkish Kant Society. I will just post the schedule here on the chat so that you can see the next sessions. And yes, so please remain connected so that we can keep on discussing this in the informal part of the session. And thank you so much.